One of the internet's most persistent fan theories is the idea that Michael Bay's 1996 action classic The Rock is in fact the last chapter of Sean Connery's run as James Bond. And I should know because exactly 5 years ago, I looked at the evidence in way too much detail and concluded that not only does the evidence support the fan theory, it lines up so well that the resulting video has had nearly 3 million views, made it to the front page of Reddit, generated a bunch of articles ripping it off, and even led to someone asking Jerry Bruckheimer if it was intentional. He said it wasn't, but what would he know about it? But despite that video still being what this channel is probably best known for, it was also one of the very first videos I ever made, and well, I'd like to think I've gotten a little bit better at this since then.
My powers have doubled since the last time we met, Count.
And so to mark 5 years since that video took my subscriber count above triple digits, and in honor of The Rock's 30th anniversary, I present to you the special extended and remastered edition of The Rock is definitely a James Bond movie. The Rock is the second feature film directed by Michael Bay. It's about decorated US war veteran Francis Hummel stealing a bunch of chemical weapons, taking hostages on Alcatraz, and holding the US government to ransom until reparations are paid to the families of the soldiers who died under his command. West Wing Chief of Staff Leo McGarry, FBI Director Jim Womack, and the Department of Defense enlist the services of convict and former British Special Forces operative John Mason to help the Navy SEALs break into Alcatraz using his knowledge of the prison from when he broke out of it in 1963. Mason teams up with chemical weapons expert Nicolas Cage, no really, we're meant to believe that, to break into Alcatraz and disarm the missiles before Hummel's deadline. Now, almost since this movie came out, there has been speculation that Sean Connery's John Mason is in fact James Bond, and you can see why.
30 years ago, he was a highly trained SAS operative.
Former SAS types with easy smiles and expensive watches.
I decided I didn't want your child growing up without a father.
We're both orphans, James.
In my day, we did it all with a snorkel and a pair of flippers. Offer me coffee.
Coffee, very black.
Oh, I was trained by the best.
British intelligence.
Well, I'm Stanley Goodspeed.
Hi, I'm Plenty.
But of course you are.
But is this just a coincidence, or is John Mason actually James Bond? Well, I'm here to tell you that he definitely is. The timelines of the Sean Connery James Bond films and The Rock match perfectly with both each other and real-world history, so get ready because we're going to look at the evidence in way more detail than anyone has done before. Except me 5 years ago. But before we start, the obvious disclaimer for some fellow James Bond geeks. Although Never Say Never Again stars Sean Connery as James Bond, it is not part of the Eon Productions film canon or continuity. And if you don't know what I mean by that, then watch this video. But for the purposes of this video, my argument is that the James Bond depicted in the 6 Eon films starring Sean Connery is the same person who appears in The Rock, so I won't be looking at Never Say Never Again in this video. And while we're on the nebulous topic of Bond continuity, I should also respond to the hundreds of comments on the original video that asked about how all of the other Bond actors fit into this theory, and it's simple. This theory focuses solely on the continuity of Sean Connery's James Bond, and treats every other Bond actor's tenure like a sort of soft reboot with a new continuity unique to that actor. So even though I may be using clips and examples from their movies when I'm talking about Bond's backstory, I do not consider Daniel Craig or Roger Moore or Pierce Brosnan to be playing the same version of James Bond as Sean Connery. Instead, I treat them more like Keaton and Bale playing two versions of Bruce Wayne. The Bruce Wayne character has the same backstory regardless of who the actor playing him is, but Bale's Batman is not the exact same literal person as Keaton's. So ignore all of the other actors because their movies exist in a different continuity to Sean Connery's. Although that being said, you can make the argument that George Lazenby was meant to be the exact same literal person as Connery's Bond. Look, I'm not going to get into that here, but what I will say is that whether or not you consider Lazenby's Bond to be part of Connery's continuity or not, the events of On Her Majesty's Secret Service don't really affect the timeline of this theory, so it doesn't matter either way. Right, that's enough about Bond continuity. Let's get back to The Rock, and we'll start with the most obvious hiccup in my theory that this character is James Bond. Because if you pay attention, you'll spot that Sean Connery's character in The Rock is called John Mason, not James Bond. So how can they be the same person? Well, one explanation is based on another fan theory that James Bond is a codename for whoever takes on the role of 007, and that John Mason is in fact the real name of Connery's James Bond. Now, like any good Bond fan, I strongly disagree with the codename theory. The Eon films have consistently established that this character's real name is James Bond through things like his marriage, his obituaries, and through his parents. No, the character's real name is James Bond, and anyone arguing otherwise should be locked in a sauna.
What the hell do you think you're doing? Now, don't you worry. But I'll tell the chef.
So why is Connery called John Mason in The Rock? Well, it's simple. John Mason is the codename. James Bond frequently uses fake names.
Mr. and Mrs. David Somerset.
Mr. Fisher?
Yes.
This way, please.
Franks. Peter Franks.
He also usually has fake documents to support his cover identity. So if we assume Bond was captured, then it makes sense that he was processed under the name listed in his fake passport. In this case, John Mason. And what supports this idea even more is the fact that in The Rock, Womack says,
"This man has no identity, not in the United States or Great Britain. He does not exist."
So after capturing Bond, they clearly ran the John Mason name through the system and got nothing, because it's not a real name. But if Bond was captured by the Americans, wouldn't the CIA or MI6 see to it that he got released? Well, not necessarily. We consistently see how M puts Queen and country above the life of his or her agents, including Bond. If M thought that it was in MI6's best interests to deny all knowledge of Bond and have him remain captured, then M would do that, just like she did to Bond in Die Another Day. And we can assume that this is what happened in The Rock.
Of course, the British claim they'd never heard of him.
So to me, it's entirely plausible that Bond was captured by the Americans while using the fake name of John Mason, put in Alcatraz, and MI6 decided to just leave him there. Right, so that's the name taken care of. Now let's look at the timeline. In The Rock, we learn that Mason was
Incarcerated on Alcatraz in 1962, escaped in 63.
So 1962 is our first data point, the same year that Dr. No came out. Now, the fan theory usually goes that Bond was first captured before the events of Dr. No, and assume that Dr. No is set in 1963 after he escaped Alcatraz. But that doesn't work. Dr. No is definitely set in 1962 or earlier because in Jamaica, Government House is flying the British flag. Jamaica became independent on the 6th of August 1962, so there is no way that Dr. No can take place in 1963 because the British no longer had control of Jamaica. So in my narrative, Bond is captured after the events of Dr. No and escapes Alcatraz before the events of the next film, From Russia with Love. If you haven't seen it, Dr. No ends with Bond destroying Dr. No's evil lair after the villain tried to disrupt a rocket launch at Cape Canaveral. He's rescued by his friend CIA agent Felix Leiter, but because Bond is Bond, he would rather get it on with Honey Rider than be rescued, so he disconnects the tow rope. It's a typical Bond movie ending, but let's be real about this. Leiter rocks up with a boat full of heavily armed goons. They're not there to rescue Bond, they're rounding up the henchmen who escaped from Dr. No's evil lair and are throwing them in the 1960s equivalent of Guantanamo Bay. Now, Leiter knows that Bond is a spy and so made sure to rescue him, but after Bond gives him the slip, he must have just been picked up by some random Navy patrol and got lumped in with all of the other prisoners. And without the CIA to vouch for him, Bond got locked up with the rest of the henchmen in Alcatraz under the fake name John Mason. And of course, he escaped. In Dr. No itself, we actually see Bond escaping from a prison, proving that he was more than capable of busting out of Alcatraz at the time. So we've established that Dr. No can't take place after August 1962, but we know that Mason escaped from Alcatraz in 63. Thankfully, the timeline works, because in the next Bond movie after Dr. No, Sylvia Trench complains that Bond disappeared for 6 months after going to Jamaica.
Last time you said that, you went off to Jamaica. I haven't seen you for 6 months.
So Bond must have escaped from Alcatraz in January 1963, meaning that Dr. No and Bond's imprisonment in Alcatraz happened 6 months earlier in July 1962, as is established in The Rock. Oh, and not that anyone cares, but I checked and there was actually a rocket launch from Cape Canaveral on the 25th of July 1962, and it was even a Titan rocket like the kind shown in Dr. No. Yeah, I told you I was going to look at this in way too much detail. So this timeline matches perfectly to the exact day the timeline of the first two Bond films, The Rock and actual world history. So far, so good. But before we look at the next data point, let's look at what The Rock has to say about why Mason was captured in the first place.
1962. J. Edgar Hoover is head of the FBI. Some say the country. It's no secret he kept microfilm files of prominent Americans, British members of Parliament, even the Prime Minister. Mason was the British operative who stole the files, but our bureau agents caught him at the Canadian border.
Now, Womack's comment implies that Mason stole the microfilm in 1962, but one of the things the microfilm contains is proof of who killed JFK.
You wanna know who really killed JFK?
So this microfilm can't possibly have existed before November 1963, and so that confirms for us that Bond's first imprisonment in Alcatraz in 1962 was unrelated to the microfilm. But that's okay, because The Rock also establishes that after he escaped in 1963, Mason was recaptured.
6 federal marshals hadn't kicked down a door and dragged you back to prison?
But it never makes it clear when he was recaptured. The closest thing we have to a data point on that is Mason's daughter, Jade. When Womack is asked why the notorious FBI founder J. Edgar Hoover didn't use Jade as leverage over Mason to reveal the location of the stolen microfilm, Womack says this.
Hoover was dead in 72. She wasn't born yet.
And this tells us two things. One, that the daughter was born sometime after Hoover died in May 1972, meaning Mason was not in prison for all of 1972. And the second thing it tells us is that Mason didn't steal the microfilm in 1962, he stole it after Hoover's death. Think about it, are we meant to believe that Mason stole the top secret microfilm, escaped Alcatraz, and instead of returning to the safety of Britain, just lived undercover in the US for 10 years or so, fathering illegitimate children until he was recaptured again? No, we're not meant to believe that, because we know what John Mason was doing between 1963 and 1972. He was being James Bond. So let's return to the earlier narrative that Bond was first captured in 1962 by mistake after Dr. No. He escaped, returned to MI6, and carried on being Bond until his last on-screen adventure, Diamonds Are Forever, which was released in 1971. And this movie ends with Bond in America, and not just anywhere in America, he's on a cruise ship leaving a city on the west coast. Now, the ship he is on is the SS Canberra. Where did the Canberra dock in 1971? That's right, San Francisco. So we can place Bond in San Francisco in 1971. Not long before John Mason was recaptured in 1972. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the history here, but suffice to say that in the early 1970s, there were some fairly big foreign policy disagreements between the British government and the Nixon administration. So with relations frosty and their best field agent already on American soil, it's not totally unrealistic for MI6 to send him in undercover to try and find the secret microfilm that has all of the dirt on the British government. So after his cruise, Bond goes undercover in the FBI, and during this time, he befriends Womack. The Rock makes it abundantly clear that these two men have a personal animosity, but never really makes it clear exactly why. Well, this is why. Womack was the person Bond used to get access to the FBI in the first place, only to betray him by stealing the microfilm. So it's no wonder that Womack doesn't trust Mason in The Rock. Now, back to the daughter. While undercover in the FBI, Bond knocks up Jade's mother after a one-night stand, which is a very James Bond thing to do, by the way.
Meeting in a bar after a Led Zeppelin concert. Hit out. And that was the result.
Led Zeppelin toured North America in 1972, so again, the real-world history checks out. Oh, and for the hundreds of people who left comments along the lines of James Bond would never go to a Led Zeppelin concert because Sean Connery's Bond says things like,
That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
Well, I agree. James Bond wouldn't go to a Led Zeppelin concert, but listen to the line.
Meeting in a bar after a Led Zeppelin concert.
They met at a bar after a Led Zeppelin concert. Jade's mother was at the concert. James Bond was at the bar picking up women, because of course he was. Anyway, after learning that Jade's mother is pregnant, Connery's Bond began to reflect on his life and career. He decides to hang up the pistol and retire once and for all. But a few weeks earlier, something else happened. J. Edgar Hoover died on the 2nd of May 1972, leaving a leadership vacuum in the FBI. MI6 saw the opportunity for Bond to exploit the vacuum and steal the microfilm. So M agrees to Bond retiring if he can pull off this one final mission. So Bond steals the file and stashes it in the church in Kansas. Why Kansas, you asked? Well, maybe it's because in 1971, James Bond heard Blofeld say,
Well, if we destroy Kansas, the world may not hear about it for years.
If you're British and don't know America very well, then doesn't that sound like a good place to hide something? So Bond stashes the microfilm in Kansas and then flees to the Canadian border, only to be captured and locked up, this time for good. And when he is captured and the FBI realize that he was an undercover agent, Bond tells them his real name is John Mason to protect MI6 again. The FBI realize that he's the same person who escaped Alcatraz in 1963, so they lock him up. MI6 deny all knowledge of him, and Bond stays in prison until the events of The Rock take place in 1995. Okay, so let's put it all together. In July 1962, James Bond defeats Dr. No but is mistakenly captured by the US Navy and locked in Alcatraz under the fake name John Mason. 6 months later, he escapes and continues to work for MI6. He carries on as Agent 007 until his final on-screen mission finishes with him in San Francisco in 1971. Bond is sent undercover in the FBI to try and locate the top-secret microfilm. In 1972, he gets Jade's mother pregnant and decides to retire. M agrees, but only after he steals the microfilm. So Bond steals it, but is captured and locked up again as John Mason, which the US believed to be his real identity based on his previous incarceration record. In 1995, the events of The Rock take place. All of the dialogue in The Rock supports the theory that John Mason is James Bond. There's just one gap. The only evidence that they might be different people is when Mason tells Hummel that he was an army captain, when we all know that James Bond is a commander in the British Navy. Well, you could just say it was Bond staying in character and leave it at that. But that's not good enough for me, and we've come this far, so get ready for the final deep dive, people, because this one will blow your frickin' socks off. Francis Hummel, the villain in The Rock, is well established as a decorated war veteran.
3 tours in Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, Desert Storm.
General Hummel in Vietnam, I think he was a major at the time.
To be a major in the US Army, you need to have 10 years of service. Hummel did 3 tours in Vietnam, so we can assume that he was fighting there from fairly early on in the US deployment. And we also learn this about him.
For Major Baxter and I, this is the last campaign in a career dating back to Tet 68.
The Tet Offensive happened in January 1968, so Hummel was already fighting in Vietnam at that time. Now, during the Vietnam War, American soldiers had respite leave in Hong Kong. So let's say that Hummel was there at the end of 1967 before returning to the war in order to be there in time for the Tet Offensive in January 1968. Now, who else was in Hong Kong in 1967? That's right, James Bond, as we saw in You Only Live Twice. Now, it's not plausible that Hummel and Bond encountered each other in Hong Kong, even though they were in the same city at the same time. But what is plausible is that Hummel picked up the newspaper one day and saw a front-page story about British Naval Commander James Bond being murdered, complete with photograph. It's a sad story for any soldier to read, and particularly one who is shown to have a huge amount of respect for the fallen. Maybe the story struck a chord with him, especially after he saw his men dying during some of the fiercest fighting of the Vietnam War. Maybe he saw the full honors bestowed to Bond by the Navy and wondered why it wasn't given to all fallen soldiers. Perhaps he went to pay respects to Bond's next of kin, only to find out that Bond's death was faked, the first time he learns that perhaps governments can't always be trusted. Maybe Hummel reading about Bond's death planted the seed in Hummel's mind that his government couldn't be trusted, and that the US didn't care for the lives of its soldiers, a seed that would grow over the next 3 decades. Maybe this newspaper article that Hummel read in Hong Kong explains why Hummel greets Bond like this.
Name and rank, sailor.
Hummel is testing Bond to see if this is in fact the same naval officer he read about all those years ago. And look at how Mason reacts to the question.
Name and rank, sailor.
It's Army, actually.
Bond knows that somehow Hummel suspects his true identity, but he sticks to his cover story and the film continues. Now, I admit that this last bit is a bit of a stretch, but it's not really a stretch in the context of James Bond movies, or Michael Bay movies for that matter. Remember, Connery's run alone expected us to believe things like body doubles with face transplants, giant space lasers, and that Sean Connery could somehow pass for a Japanese fisherman. I mean, frankly, by the standards of Bond villain backstories, I'd actually say the Hummel-Bond connection is pretty tame. So there you have solid gold proof that John Mason in The Rock is the same character as Sean Connery's James Bond. The continuity of The Rock and the Bond films perfectly overlap with each other, and more than that, they align perfectly with the real-world events happening at those times. Every single line of dialogue about John Mason's backstory supports this theory, as does Sean Connery's portrayal of the character. And that is why, 5 years later, there is no doubt in my mind that The Rock is definitely a James Bond movie. I hope you enjoyed this remastered and updated edition of my original video. It's fair to say that without that video being as successful as it was, I probably wouldn't still be here 5 years later, and I'm so grateful to every single person who has watched and engaged with my videos in that time. Like, this whole channel is just something I do as a hobby alongside my day job, and like, I don't have a team behind me. Every single one of these videos is researched, written, recorded, filmed, and edited by me and me alone. Even the ones that are over an hour long. But I have had so much fun building this channel and community, and I love that I have a way to share my passion for movies with all of you, and it kind of all goes back to that upload 5 years ago when I had like 100 subscribers. So whether you've been here since then, or if you've only just discovered the channel, seriously, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.